At 3:30 hours local time, a Ukrainian control crew watched 8 AN-196 Lyutyi attack drones launch from a secret site in Kherson, disappear into the darkness, and descend to an altitude of 50 feet above the marshland. They were heading toward a bridge 150 miles to the southeast, the Syvash Railway Bridge, the strategic gateway connecting Crimea with Kherson. What they did not know was that the Russians had identified the corridor the UAVs would be forced to use, and they were waiting at the end of it. 30 miles to the east, a Russian operator leaned close to the display of a 1L-222 Avtobaza-M electronic reconnaissance system. What appeared before him was only a handful of weak data transmission pulses emerging and disappearing inside the interference. But all of them were coming from the northwest, and all of them were converging on the same area. Behind the lead group, the 8 remaining Lyutyi drones spread widely across the lake, descending to between 40 and 50 feet and skimming just above the water. Their engines reduced revolutions. Trees and marshland rushed beneath them so quickly that the optical sensors could barely maintain a stable image. All 16 UAVs shared the same design, but they were not carrying out the same mission. The 8 drones in front would serve as decoys. They transmitted stronger signals, flew higher, and deliberately tried to attract the attention of Russian radars. The 8 drones in the rear group reduced their transmission power, divided into 2 formations, and maintained an extremely low altitude. If Russian missiles opened fire on the lead group, the remaining 8 would penetrate the gap before the air defense systems could switch targets. At least that was the plan. Flying low over flat terrain allowed the Lyutyi drones to remain below the line of sight of the long-range Nebo-SVU surveillance radar positioned 20 miles to the west. To the radar, they appeared little different from small signals blending into the water surface in the layer of mist near the ground. It was like discovering that the safest place to hide something valuable was inside a box so ordinary that no one would ever want to open it. But flying low also came at a price. At an altitude of 50 feet, a UAV could not simply fly straight across any section of the marshland. Below was the Syvash, a maze of saltwater lagoons, deep mudflats, and unstable strips of land. Only a few corridors were flat enough and aligned in the correct direction to approach the bridge. Any Ukrainian planner looking at the map would choose those corridors, and the Russians had known exactly which routes they would choose for a very long time. The report from the Avtobaza-M was transmitted to a command vehicle concealed behind a raised strip of land on the eastern shore of the Syvash. Inside, the electronic warfare officer watched the weak signal pulses appear and disappear every few seconds. It was not a continuous video link. They were only extremely short data packets used to correct direction, change altitude, and confirm the flight route. A nearby Krasuka 4 system was ready to begin jamming, but the Russian commander ordered it to remain silent. If the signal were cut at that moment, the 8 Lyutyi drones in the rear could switch to autonomous mode. The Ukrainians would know that the corridor had been detected. Russia did not want to block the link. It wanted to know where the link led, but there was one thing they had not expected. In addition to the 16 Lyutyi drones heading toward the Syvash Bridge, there was a signal from a 17th UAV. It was an unarmed PD-2 circling at high altitude above Ukrainian territory. It was operating as an airborne relay station. The distance from the control crew in Kherson to the bridge was as much as 150 miles. At that range, the curvature of the Earth and the low terrain made it impossible for a ground antenna to maintain communication with UAVs flying at an altitude of 50 feet. The PD-2 stood between the two ends of the signal. One link extended back toward the operating team. The other was directed toward the Lyutyi formation. The UAVs already had their flight route stored in memory. The relay station transmitted only critical commands: change corridors, descend, accelerate, or switch to a secondary target. It was like a lighthouse suspended in the sky. It helped the UAVs find their way through the darkness, but its light could also be seen from very far away. 2 Torn-MDM stations along the eastern shore of the Syvash began measuring the angle of arrival of each signal pulse. The data was transmitted to the Moskva-1. The Russians did not need to decode the commands. They only needed to know when the signal appeared, how strong it was, and which direction it came from. After several orbits by the PD-2, the bearing lines began to intersect. Russia determined the location of the relay station and realized that it was communicating with a transmission source farther to the northwest. Encryption could conceal the content, but it could not conceal the fact that a command had just been transmitted. At the end of the Syvash corridor, Panzer S-1 systems and Tu-2S-38 Derivatsiya-PVO anti-aircraft guns kept their radars in standby mode. The 8 decoy Lyutyi drones continued flying higher and transmitting stronger signals. Russia allowed them to move deeper into the engagement zone. Only when the lead group crossed the raised road did the Panzer S-1 radar switch on. A 5.7E6 missile launched from its firing unit. The 30mm 2 A-38M cannons began sweeping across the alternate corridor. The strike was not designed only to shoot down the UAVs. It was designed to force Ukraine to change its plan. The 8 Lyutyi drones in the rear immediately divided into two groups. One group descended close to the water. The others shifted toward the western edge of the mudflat. The data packets transmitted through the PD-2 became more frequent. On the Moskva-1 display, the communication link formed a clear triangle. The Lyutyi drones to the south, the PD-2 in the middle, and the operating team to the northwest. An Orlan-30 was sent toward the suspected area. Its infrared sensor detected a generator beneath camouflage netting, a directional antenna changing its angle, and the heat signature of a command vehicle parked beside a trench. The optical data matched the radio bearing. Russia had found the area where the Ukrainian operating team was located near the Syvash Bridge. The remaining Lyutyi drones were only 8 miles from the target. The railway spans began to emerge through the mist. But 30 miles away, a Lancet 3 had just descended and switched to optical search mode. The Ukrainian operating team believed that they were controlling the hunt. They did not know that for the past 20 minutes they had been the prey. The Ukrainian operators understood that every command transmission left a trace. So they kept the data packets sent through the PD-2 under 1 second and continued pushing the Lyutyi drones deeper into the corridor. At an altitude of 50 feet, the UAVs skimmed above the water at 100 miles per hour, but there was no longer any escape route on either side. To the east were deep mudflats. To the west were salt lakes and unstable strips of land. The attack package was now locked inside a lane less than 8 miles wide. If fire appeared ahead, they would not have enough room to spread out. And this was what the Ukrainian crew did not know. The Russians were not trying to prevent them from entering the corridor. They had prepared the corridor to keep them inside. The lead Lyutyi had just crossed the raised road when the 1 RS-2 radar of a Panzer S-1 system suddenly switched on. Within 4 seconds, the target was detected, tracked, and transferred into firing mode. A 5.7E6 missile left the launcher. It accelerated beyond Mach 3 and raced toward the target from a distance of only 4 miles. There was little time to think. The Lyutyi's onboard control computer immediately pulled the nose upward, climbed, and made a sharp turn to the left. The missile passed behind it and detonated outside the lethal radius. The UAV shook violently but continued flying. On the display in Kherson, the target icon stabilized again. The control crew believed they had just passed through the first defensive layer, but the Panzer S-1 did not need to score a hit. It only needed to force the Lyutyi to climb. Remember that climb. At an altitude of 50 feet, the UAV was still concealed within reflections from the water, fog, and mudflats. But after climbing several hundred feet, the background behind it was no longer chaotic terrain. Behind it was open sky. The heat signature from the engine became clearer. The nearly 20-foot wingspan separated from the background. Russian electro-optical sensors could now maintain a stable track on the target. The Lyutyi had avoided the straight punch, but that evasive move had lifted it directly into position for the next hook. From the eastern side of the corridor, a 2S-38 Derivatsiya-PVO raised its 57mm cannon. The first burst was fired at a rate of about 120 rounds per minute. The first round passed low. The second went ahead of the target. The third exploded beside the left wing. Fragments tore through the control surface. The Lyutyi banked sharply, rolled sideways, and plunged into the mudflat. The second UAV immediately turned west. That was the logical reaction when fire came from the right, but the Russians had anticipated that response. A second Derivatsiya-PVO had remained silent on the opposite side of the corridor. When the Lyutyi changed direction, its 57mm cannon opened fire from the left plane. A few seconds later, the UAV's airframe broke apart in midair. The two gun positions created an overlapping engagement zone several miles wide. If the Lyutyi continued flying low, the Panzer S-1 would force it to evade. If it climbed, the Derivatsiya-PVO would see it. If it turned toward either side, the gun on the opposite flank was already waiting. That was the entire design of the ambush. The terrain forced the UAVs into the corridor. The Panzer S-1 triggered the evasive reaction. The two Derivatsiya-PVO systems destroyed the targets after they left their concealment. The Ukrainian crew had evaded the first missile, but that was not the moment they escaped the trap. That was the moment the trap truly closed. The two Panzer S-1 systems hidden in the Syvash marshes have a combined value of $90 million, and in just about 90 seconds, both will be neutralized by UAVs costing $55,000 each, cheaper than even a used car. What is remarkable is that the Russians were not caught by surprise. They were the ones who had set up this ambush. But the Panzer S-1 had two very important weaknesses that morning. First, it had to activate its radar to detect, track, and guide the 57E6 missile toward its target. When the radar was operating, the Panzer could see the UAV, but the UAV could also know exactly where the Panzer was. It was like a person hiding in a dark room and turning on a flashlight to search for an intruder. The light helped him see what was in front of him, but it also revealed his position to everyone outside. The second weakness was simpler. The Panzer had missiles, radar, and two 30mm cannons, but it was still only a vehicle with limited armor. It was extremely dangerous while it remained hidden, but when it was forced to fire continuously, it became a large target filled with missiles and cannon ammunition. The two Panzer systems now stood on opposite sides of the Syvash corridor. The surviving Lyutyi UAVs had to fly through the crossfire zone between the salt lakes and the mudflats. 57E6 missiles continuously left their launchers. The 30mm cannons swept across the mist. The surface of the marsh flashed under the light of the missile engines. The Russian commander watched the UAV symbols disappear from the screen one by one. Everything was unfolding according to plan. Meanwhile, the Avtobaza-M, Torn-MDM, and Moskva-1 continued tracing the data packets transmitted through the PD-2. An Orlan 30 detected the Ukrainian generator, directional antenna, and command vehicle beneath camouflage netting. A Lancet 3 was dispatched to the area. Russia did not only want to shoot down the UAVs, they wanted to eliminate the people controlling them as well. The firefight became intense. One Lyutyi was forced to climb by a missile and was then struck by cannon fire. The second turned west and was also shot down. Debris fell into the marsh. The Russians believed the trap had succeeded, but the UAVs that had just been destroyed were only decoys. One Lyutyi continued climbing, forcing the Eastern Panzer S-1 to keep its radar active and launch more missiles. Another moved toward the opposite flank, causing the second Panzer S-1 to also activate its radar and open fire. The Russians thought the UAVs were panicking and searching for an escape route. But one climbed because Ukraine wanted the first radar to continue transmitting. The other changed direction because they wanted the second radar to reveal itself as well. The Russians had fired at everything that appeared, exactly as planned. And they had also just done exactly what Ukraine needed. Because the moment the two Panzer radars activated, they stopped being invisible predators. They became targets. Throughout that time, two other Lyutyi UAVs continued circling outside the corridor. They did not attack the bridge. They did not charge toward the launchers. They preserved their fuel and warheads for two targets that had not yet appeared. The radars of the two Panzer S-1 systems. Once the two emitters were confirmed, the coordinates were immediately transmitted through the PD-2. The two UAVs simultaneously changed course toward the marsh. The Russians were still watching the targets in front of them. They did not realize that the two most dangerous threats were approaching from both flanks. The trap Russia had set for the Ukrainian UAVs was now beginning to turn against the very people operating it. The two Panzer S-1 radars lit up across the marshes and began transmitting across the Syvash. The two FP2s changed course immediately. The rotating radar assemblies on top of the vehicles were the targets they had been waiting for. The same rule Russia had just used to track the Ukrainian operators had now been turned against them. The transmitter had become the target, and it could not go silent. The Panzer had to keep its radar active in order to track the UAVs and guide its 57E6 missiles, which were flying at more than Mach 3. If it shut the radar down, the missiles would lose guidance. If it kept transmitting, the FP2S could pinpoint its position even more easily. The Panzer was like a man forced to turn on every light in his house in order to see an intruder, but every light also told the intruder exactly which room to charge into. The two FP2s came in from both flanks while the radars remained focused on the decoy Lyutyis ahead. The distance dropped to 4 miles, then 2 miles. The first UAV slammed into the eastern radar array. The antenna shattered into spinning fragments of metal. The electronic compartment beneath it was destroyed. A few seconds later, the second FP2 hit the hull of the Western Panzer. The missiles and cannon ammunition inside detonated in sequence, turning the vehicle into a fireball in the reeds. Both systems were disabled in less than 90 seconds. The FP2 has a wingspan of nearly 20 feet, a launch weight of about 480 pounds, and carries a 240-pound warhead. Its range is about 124 miles, nearly the same as the distance from Los Angeles to San Diego. It can fly autonomously to a fixed target or be guided manually through a radio link. That morning, the two FP2s were guided manually through the PD-2 relay. That allowed them to change course the moment the two Panzer radars revealed themselves. The two UAVs cost less than 1% of the combined value of the two Panzer S-1s they had just disabled. Even though those systems were worth as much as $90 million, the two drones would not return. But the planners had calculated that from the beginning. A 231-pound warhead crashing into a lightly armored vehicle packed with missiles and ammunition was never going to be an even exchange. And the moment the two radars went dark, the crossfire zone over the Syvash corridor disappeared with them. The road to the bridge had just been opened. Back in the Syvash corridor, the surviving Lyutyi drones immediately descended to an altitude of about 40 feet and raced toward the bridge. Behind them, one Panzer S-1 burned fiercely among the reeds while the other remained standing on the salt flat. But the radar assembly on its roof was gone. Ukraine had reversed the ambush. The hunters had just become the hunted. But 30 miles away, the Russian electronic warfare officer paid almost no attention to the two Panzer systems that had just disappeared from the command network. To him, the burning vehicles were only noise. The signal behind them was the real prize. For more than 20 minutes, the Avtobaza-M and Torn-MDM had recorded every short data packet transmitted through the PD-2. A command to change direction, a request to descend, a target confirmation packet. Each transmission lasted less than 1 second, but every signal pulse added another bearing line to the map. The Moskva-1 overlaid those bearing lines. At first, the suspected area covered several miles. The next time, it narrowed to a strip of land. After several more transmissions, the Russians had a coordinate grid accurate enough to hand over. They had just lost 2 air defense vehicles, but believed they had found something far more difficult to replace. The people controlling the entire attack. A new Panzer could be brought in within a few days. But a control crew capable of coordinating decoys, a relay station, and multiple UAV groups in real time could not be replaced so easily. Only 3 minutes later, an Orlan 30 appeared above the suspected area. It carried no warhead, it did not dive, and it did not attack. It simply circled slowly and patiently, and that was more dangerous than an immediate strike. The Orlan 30 had not come to destroy the Ukrainian crew. It had come to see them. Its infrared sensor detected a hot generator beneath camouflage netting. Nearby, a directional antenna was continuously adjusting its angle toward the PD-2, circling at high altitude. Beside the trench stood a command vehicle, and one soldier had just stepped outside to pull a cable before quickly disappearing back into the bunker. The optical data matched the radio coordinates. Russia had found the real target. A Lancet 3 was immediately launched to complete the rest of the mission. The Orlan 30 would keep the target inside the frame while the Lancet delivered the strike. That was the difference between throwing a punch with your eyes closed and throwing one while someone stood behind your opponent, continuously pointing to the exact place you needed to hit. Inside the bunker in Kherson, the Ukrainian crew was still looking toward the bridge. The distance was now only 7 miles. With no Panzer missiles forcing the Lyutyi drones to climb against the open sky, they continued skimming above the water, blending into the fog and mud flats. The control crew believed the most difficult part was over. But then the image from the PD-2 began to stutter slightly. One data packet disappeared. Outside the bunker, a soldier looked upward and heard the sound of a small engine repeating with every orbit. There was no scream of a UAV diving toward them. There was only an aircraft patiently circling overhead. The Ukrainian crew immediately understood what was happening. An attack UAV would dive in and disappear. A reconnaissance UAV would remain, observe, update the coordinates, and wait for another weapon to arrive and finish the job. Now they had to choose. If they cut communications, the Lyutyi drones could continue along their programmed flight routes, but they would be unable to change targets during the final minutes. If they continued transmitting commands, they would retain control, but every signal packet would also tell the Russians that the bunker was still active. If they abandoned the position, the Orlan 30 would see the entire process of dismantling the antenna, pulling down the camouflage netting, and moving the command vehicle. The reconnaissance UAV did not need to know which option they chose. It only needed to keep circling near the Syvash Bridge. The lead Lyutyi had locked its camera onto the railway tracks. Inside the bunker, the operator placed the aiming marker over the first steel span. At that exact moment, a soldier outside shouted. A small black dot had just appeared beneath the cloud layer, approaching from the southeast. The Orlan 30 was still circling overhead. The Lancet 3 had found the target area. Ukraine had just broken the trap at the Syvash Bridge, but Russia was closing a second trap, not around the UAVs, but around the people controlling them. Only 5 seconds after detecting the Orlan 30 circling above the control bunker, Ukraine launched an interceptor FPV. It carried no warhead. Its only mission was to collide with the reconnaissance UAV before it could continue correcting the target coordinates for the Lancet 3. The first FPV climbed sharply through the mist, but missed the Orlan 30 because of the delay in the transmitted video. It lost control and crashed into the mudflat. The second approached from a lower angle. Instead of pursuing the target, the operator positioned it ahead of the Orlan 30's circular flight path and waited. The distance fell to 300 feet, then 150 feet. A moment later, the two UAVs collided. The FPV broke apart while the Orlan 30 lost part of its wing and plunged into the reeds less than a mile from the bunker. Russia had just lost the eye tracking the target, but before it was brought down, the Orlan 30 had confirmed the locations of the generator, antenna, command vehicle, and bunker entrance. Those coordinates had already been transmitted to the Lancet 3. Destroying the Orlan meant that Russia's data could no longer be updated in real time. The Lancet continued flying toward a target area several hundred yards wide. Meanwhile, the surviving Lyutyi drones were only 2.5 miles from the Syvash Bridge. Dense fog and a crosswind of nearly 20 miles per hour gradually pushed the formation away from its approach axis. One UAV drifted toward the mudflat while the aiming marker of the lead aircraft remained misaligned with the railway span. Without correction, the warhead could fall into the marsh instead of striking the bridge. The control crew was forced to continue transmitting commands through the PD-2. Correct 4 degrees to the left. Descend another 10 feet. Reduce speed. Each data packet lasted less than 1 second, but the Avtobaza-M and Torn-MDM could still detect them. The Moskva 1 continued adding bearing lines to the coordinates it already had. The same system keeping the Lyutyi drones on course was also guiding the Lancet closer to the bunker. There was no backup crew close enough to take control. The UAVs also could not wait for the operating team to relocate. The distance was now 2 miles. One Lyutyi continued drifting to the right. The operator corrected its course. A new signal pulse appeared on the Russian display. The distance was now 1.5 miles. The camera still could not clearly see the steel span. Another descent command was transmitted. Outside the bunker, Ukrainian soldiers removed unnecessary equipment and prepared fire extinguishers, but the command vehicle could not move while the link with the PD-2 remained active. Then one soldier looked upward. Beneath the low cloud layer, a black dot appeared from the southeast. It was not circling. It was flying directly toward the final coordinates. The Lancet 3 had arrived, and the Lyutyi drones were still nearly 2 miles from the Syvash Bridge. The control crew had only a few minutes left to complete the attack before the Russian strike reached the bunker. The Ukrainian crew was not forced to choose between the mission and their lives. They had prepared a backup control team. For more than 20 minutes, Team A maintained communications through the first PD-2, causing the Avtobaza-M and Moskva 1 to trace the signal back to the bunker in Kherson. Russia believed this was the only control center, but 30 miles to the northwest, a second PD-2 had been circling in silence since before the attack began. When the formation was about 3 miles from the Syvash Bridge, Team B transmitted a short authentication packet and took control. None of the UAVs slowed down or changed direction. Team A immediately shut down its equipment, folded the antenna, and left the bunker. Behind them, they left a decoy transmitter that continued repeating the previous signal pattern. On the Russian display, the position still appeared to be active. Less than a minute later, the Lancet 3 broke through the low cloud layer and dived toward the final coordinates. With no Orlan 30 remaining to update the imagery, it struck the generator, the decoy transmitter, and the bunker entrance. Russia believed the control crew had been destroyed, but the bunker was empty. 30 miles away, Team B was still watching the live imagery from the attack formation. The 2 Panzer S-1 systems had been disabled, opening the final corridor to the bridge. The UAVs descended to 40 feet, skimming through the fog and reflections from the water. A crosswind of nearly 20 miles per hour continued pushing them away from the approach axis, but Team B needed to send only 3 commands: correct left, descend, accelerate. The Avtobaza-M detected the new transmission source, but it was already too late. Russia needed more time to locate the second control team, while the FP2s were less than a mile from the bridge. Team B did not aim at the largest section of the bridge. They aimed at its most important load-bearing points. The first FP2 struck the middle of the span, damaging the railway tracks and crossbeams. 30 seconds later, the second crashed into the joint between 2 spans, causing the southern section to begin sagging. The third flew close to the water and struck the southern support pier, blasting away concrete and exposing the reinforcing steel inside. 3 UAVs, 3 load-bearing points, the middle of the span, the joint, the support pier. The bridge did not. collapsed completely, but it was no longer safe enough for a logistics train to cross. The warning was issued when the Russian train was only a few miles from the bridge. The emergency brakes activated, causing dozens of cars behind it to compress forward before the train stopped directly in front of the damaged section. The railway line was immediately closed. Repairs were no longer as simple as replacing several sections of track. Engineers had to inspect the support pier, replace deformed steel, reinforce the joint, and lift the sagging span back into position. During that time, fuel, ammunition, and vehicles were trapped at both ends of the route. Cargo had to be transferred onto trucks and moved along roads that were longer, slower, and easier to detect. Russia had traced the correct signal, found the correct bunker, and struck the correct coordinates, but they arrived too late. When the Lancet dived, Team A had already left. When the Moskva-1 detected the new transmitter, the UAVs were already directly in front of the bridge. And when Russia realized that control had been transferred, 3 warheads had already struck 3 different load-bearing points. The Russian ambush found the control crew, but only after the mission had already been handed over to someone else. That was why the ambush succeeded, and also why it failed. In your opinion, what was the decisive factor in this mission? The backup control team, the second PD-2, or the way the 3 UAVs struck 3 load-bearing points? Leave your opinion below. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next military analysis.